So, if you take apart a car engine, right, the mechanic can just point to the spark plugs, trace the fuel line, and, tell you exactly how the whole thing runs.
Right, because it's entirely visible.
Exactly. It's completely visible. But how do you prove an event actually happened when the engine is, well, permanently welded shut inside an impenetrable black box?
I mean, it forces you to completely abandon the mechanical approach altogether.
Yeah.
You can't ask how the gears turn anymore because, you're never going to see them. So you have to ask an entirely different set of questions.
And that dilemma is basically the engine for today's deep dive.
Yeah.
We're looking at this really complex, highly mathematical dissertation on New Testament Christology.
Which sounds daunting, I know.
Right, but instead of approaching the theology with, traditional philosophy, the author treats it like a literal physics problem. They use mathematical frameworks specifically, TCS and CST.
Yeah, and we should probably define those immediately for everyone. So TCS stands for topological constraint satisfaction. And CST is combinatorial structural topology. And I know that sounds like a massive mouthful.
It really does.
But topology is essentially just the mathematics of shapes and spaces, like how properties are preserved even when things get stretched out or deformed. And combinatorics is just the math of how things arrange and combine.
Okay, so the author is literally looking at the shape of these historical claims and how the data points combine, rather than trying to, psychoanalyze ancient texts.
Exactly. It completely strips away all that mystical, esoteric language. I mean, traditional theology has spent centuries trying to explain the mechanism of the Incarnation, the exact biological or metaphysical how of the divine becoming human.
Right, all those huge councils.
Yeah. They use this really dense speculative metaphysics to try and pry open that engine block. But this paper establishes a hard boundary. It introduces this concept of an epistemic boundary, or an event horizon.
Just like a black hole in astrophysics.
Precisely. The event horizon of a black hole is that boundary beyond which nothing, not even light, can escape.
Wow.
So we cannot, in principle, ever observe what happens inside it. And the author applies that exact mathematical concept directly to the Incarnation. Inside the boundary is the actual mechanism of divine human generation, and we cannot see it.
And, more importantly, we are permanently locked out. We will never see it.
We won't. But, and sticking with the astrophysics analogy here, we can observe what is happening outside a black hole's event horizon.
Right, the effects of it.
Exactly. We observe the gravitational effects, the radiation, the pull on the surrounding stars. So in the case of the New Testament, what we observe outside the boundary are the historical claims, the recorded actions, the early community formation, and, the apostolic testimony.
So if we have this boundary, we just have to completely shift our methodology.
Yeah.
Like, if you are a detective arriving at a bank vault and the money is gone, but the security cameras were off, you don't have the video of the crime.
Right, you don't have the mechanism.
Exactly. But you have constraints. You have a timeline. You have footprints. You have a blown lock. You basically build a network of constraints to figure out what must have happened based on the shape of the evidence left behind.
And this is exactly what the paper calls constraint-based epistemology. When you can't access that core mechanism, truth evaluation just becomes this exercise in selecting the model that preserves all the observable facts with the minimal amount of auxiliary assumptions.
Minimal assumptions, right?
Yeah. In statistical and mathematical modeling, this is actually referred to as having the lowest degrees of freedom, or DOE.
Okay, wait. Break down degrees of freedom for me in this specific context.
Sure. Think of degrees of freedom as the number of excuses or new rules you have to invent to make your theory actually fit the data.
Oh, I see.
A robust mathematical model has a really low DOE. It just naturally fits. A weak model has a high DOE, meaning you have to constantly tweak the parameters or, ignore certain footprints or invent complex backstories just to explain away the evidence that doesn't fit your theory.
Okay, so the author maps out all the footprints outside this theological event horizon. What exactly are the constraints that they isolate?
So the dissertation meticulously maps out 8 observable constraints. They're labeled C1 through C8. And rather than just listing them all at once, let's just look at the foundational ones.
Let's do it.
C1 is the historical existence of Jesus. C2 represents his unique claims to divine sonship. And C3 is the multi-source testimony of the resurrection.
Wait, hold on. Let me just push back on that for a second. Are C2 and C3 actually constraints, or are they just historical claims? Because, I mean, people claim crazy things all the time, right?
Yeah.
How does a claim function as a mathematical constraint?
That is a really vital distinction. They function as constraints because they are anchored into the public historical narrative in a way that rigidly dictates the subsequent data.
Okay.
The author isn't saying that the claim proves the event. The author is just saying the fact that this specific high-stakes claim was made and recorded is a hard data point that any viable theory has to account for.
Oh, I get it.
If your theory ignores the claim, your theory fails the topology of the event.
Got it. It's like an immovable piece of the puzzle. So what else is in the network?
Well, we have C4, which is the incredibly rapid formation of the early community. C5 is the multi-author narrative coherence. And this isn't just saying, like, oh, different writers agreed.
Right.
Mathematically, C5 refers to a deep structural unity across entirely distinct, geographically separated authors who are all somehow pulling from the exact same topological framework without a centralized editor telling them what to say.
Which naturally brings in C6, C7, and C8.
Correct. So C6 is a non-coercive structure. C7 is a narrative continuity that flows logically from Adam to Christ and then to the believers. And finally, C8, which is massive, the high-cost commitment of the early followers.
Meaning they were, willing to face execution for these specific claims. I mean, for you listening, when you face information overload in your own life or career, building a network of observable facts like this is just a brilliant way to filter out the noise.
Oh, absolutely.
You stop worrying about the hidden mechanisms you can't see, and you map out the hard data you do have.
It creates a really disciplined boundary for inquiry, because once you have that constraint graph constructed those 8 points, you have this rigid shape. And you can start basically forcing competing theories through that shape to see what breaks.
So let's run the data through them.
Yeah.
Let's stress test the most common alternative theories of Jesus against this mathematical constraint network.
Let's start with the legendary development model. This is the super widespread idea that the story of Jesus was essentially just a myth that snowballed over several generations.
Okay, I have to play devil's advocate here, because legends can spring up incredibly fast. I mean, look at the modern internet.
Right.
A rumor on social media becomes an accepted fact by millions of people in a matter of days. So why does this author say the historical timeline strictly forbids a legend from forming?
It's a totally fair question, but it really comes down to the combinatorial explosion of the constraints.
Explain that.
An internet rumor is usually just a single low-cost data point. But a legend that simultaneously accounts for C4, C5, C6, and C8, that is structurally impossible in the given time frame.
Right, because of all the moving parts.
Yeah. You have rapid community formation across a wide geography that's C4 generating multi-author coherence without a central editing authority, C5,
Yeah.
all anchored in a non-coercive structure, C6 requiring individuals to willingly walk into Roman executions, which is C8.
Wow.
Legends just take time to culturally bake to the point where diverse populations will actually die for a unified, complex philosophical framework.
So the timeline constraint, combined with the high-cost commitment, just shatters the legend model. It demands way too many degrees of freedom to explain why all these completely independent people died for a rumor they would have frankly known was a rumor.
Exactly. You have to invent way too many complex psychological anomalies, which naturally leads us directly to the psychological model, or the mass hallucination theory.
I assume that model just completely shatters against the multi-author narrative coherence.
It does. It severely fragments the unity of the narrative. It has incredibly weak explanatory scope. I mean, it might explain one person's isolated vision on a random Tuesday.
Right.
But it utterly fails to account for a sustained, highly structured formation of a community that completely reoriented their lives based on shared interactive experiences. To make the hallucination theory work, you have to raise those degrees of freedom significantly.
By inventing stuff.
Yeah, inventing unprecedented, synchronized mass hallucinations that have literally never been documented in all of human history.
And if we look at the fabrication hypothesis, like the idea that a small group of people just made the whole thing up for power or influence.
That one crashes instantly into the motivation constraint, but maybe more importantly, it absolutely fails C6, the non-coercive structure constraint.
I actually want to spend a minute on C6 because it's one of the most compelling insights in the entire dissertation.
It really is.
The paper points out how mathematically anomalous it is, that the New Testament narrative relies almost entirely on invitation rather than force. Like it records its own failures.
Yeah, constant loan.
It shows the supposed heroes abandoning their leader in his absolute darkest hour. It records mass rejections by the public without ever trying to retroactively suppress them. And it lacks any institutional enforcement mechanism whatsoever. If you are fabricating a religion to consolidate power in the ancient world, you absolutely do not build the framework like that.
No, you build it with a sword, and you make your founders look completely infallible.
Exactly.
The combinatorial shape of these 8 constraints is so incredibly specific that every time a skeptical model tries to explain one away, it directly contradicts another one. The paper basically argues that because these alternative models require impossibly high degrees of freedom, the New Testament model just holds up as the most structurally coherent.
It's the only one that fits the shape.
Right. Testimony, when it is rigorously calibrated by this kind of consistency, has to become our primary interface with reality when the actual mechanisms are opaque.
But okay, if this constraint model is so clean and the topology is so coherent, why is historical theology so incredibly messy?
Ah,
I mean, look at the Council of Nicaea in early Christian history. They spent centuries writing just volumes of wildly confusing, highly defensive metaphysics. They literally fought wars over single words.
and that is exactly where the dissertation shifts into historical analysis. It argues that what happened at Nicaea was essentially a massive clash of operating systems.
So for you listening, think of ancient Greek thought and ancient Hebrew thought like Mac versus PC. They are fundamentally different, essentially incompatible ways of processing reality.
The paper breaks this down into 2 completely distinct ontological frameworks. Ontology, just to be clear, is the study of the nature of being.
Okay.
So in the Greek substance ontology, identity is totally discrete and individuated. Think of it like a pool table. You have distinct, separate billiard balls.
Okay, separate objects.
Yeah, and relations between those balls are secondary. Their primary reality is their separate substance. So in that framework, to say someone is a son is just a relational label applied to 2 completely separate entities.
And when early theologians who were, entirely educated in that Greek philosophy tried to apply that billiard ball logic to the Incarnation, it just created panic.
Absolute parent.
It introduced what the author calls defensive metaphysics. You start obsessing over equality and substance differentiation. Because if everything is a separate object, you have to precisely define how this divine object relates to that divine object without them, like competing for space.
Exactly. It completely forces you into a defensive posture. But then you look at the operating system, the text was actually written in the Hebrew participation ontology.
The Mac to the PC.
Right. In the Hebrew framework, identity isn't a discrete object bouncing around a pool table. It is continuous and generative. Think of it more like a river flowing into a stream. To say you are in something means real ontological participation in its ongoing reality. Sonship isn't a secondary label. It is the actual structural extension of an identity stream.
This is a massive correction the paper points out. It completely changed how I read these historical texts. In Hebrew thought, derivation does not imply inferiority.
That is a profoundly difficult concept for the Western mind to really grasp.
Let me say it again, just because it's so critical.
Yeah.
From the Father does not mean less than the Father. Generation encodes relation, not hierarchy.
Yes. In a Greek mindset, if B comes from A is primary and B is a secondary copy. It's inherently lesser. But in the Hebrew continuous mindset, the stream is just the stream. It's the exact same water.
Right.
So when the early church tried to explain a Hebrew text using Greek philosophical software, it crashed.
It generated endless error messages. And so the Nicene theology we have today isn't necessarily a perfect explanatory model of the truth. The dissertation frames it instead as a constraint protection system.
I love that phrase.
Right. Nicaea was a defensive wall built to protect the data points from Greek misunderstandings. But by using Greek tools to build that wall, it overspecified things we can't actually know, and it deeply underspecified that beautiful Hebrew idea of generative continuity.
Exactly. Nicaea defended the boundaries of the event horizon, but it kind of lost the language for the organic connectivity, which naturally forces us to ask mathematically, how does that generative continuity actually function in a way that we can understand today?
And this brings us to what is easily the heaviest piece of academic jargon in the entire paper, traducianism.
Yeah, it's a big one.
When I first saw that word, I literally reached for a dictionary. Break down what traducianism actually means for the listener.
Well, in this specific framework, traducianism is a structural model for identity propagation. To really understand it, we have to contrast it with the standard model that most people just assume, which is creationism.
And we don't mean the creation of the earth here.
No, not the earth, the creation of the soul. The creationist model assumes that God individually knits every single new human soul from scratch and drops it into a biological body.
Which, if we look at it mathematically, means humanity is just billions of disconnected, separately created entities.
Exactly. And that creates a massive epistemic fracture. It requires incredibly high degrees of freedom to explain how a completely fresh, uniquely created soul somehow inherits the historical, structural corruption of humanity.
Because it's completely new.
Right. Traducianism, on the other hand, views humanity as a continuous manifold. We are a single continuous stream of biological and spiritual propagation. The soul, the consciousness, the identity, it is generated structurally from the parents, exactly like the biology.
It's like a single vine growing outward, extending itself, rather than, a bunch of separate seeds being individually dropped from the sky by a farmer.
Yes, that's a great analogy. And structurally, this solves a huge problem in the narrative constraints. The text talks about corrupted propagation like being in Adam, and it talks about a restored propagation being in Christ.
Wait, okay, so if we apply this continuous manifold idea, being in Christ isn't just some legal metaphor about a judge banging a gavel in a courtroom. It is a literal structural graft into a restored lineage.
Exactly. Legal models of salvation have very weak participatory reality. They're basically just declarations. But traducianism provides an actual topological framework for real ontological participation. The identity stream is literally rerouted.
And I have to stop you. We still run into a wall. Even if humanity is this continuous stream, we still don't know how consciousness actually transfers from parent to child.
And that right there is the most grounding, brilliant insight in the entire dissertation. The author points out that all generative processes involving consciousness are entirely opaque.
Wait, explain what you mean by that.
Think about ordinary, everyday human reproduction.
Okay.
We have microscopes, we fully understand the biology, the cellular division, the DNA replication, but the actual mechanism of consciousness transferring, the exact microsecond a new subjective I comes into existence from the material of two parents. We do not observe that mechanism. Oh my gosh.
We observe the emergence of a baby, we observe the outcome outside the boundary, but the actual generative transfer of consciousness is an absolute epistemic boundary. It is literally an event horizon right in our own hospital rooms.
Oh, wow. That completely changes the scale of the argument. So the incarnation isn't actually some bizarre, unique anomaly that defies all human logic. It is just a non-temporal version of the exact same biological mystery we see in everyday reproduction.
Precisely. The author defines this mathematically as the unified generative operator.
The unified generative operator.
Right. There is temporal propagation for human lineage parents to children over time, and there is non-temporal generation for divine relation. But mathematically, both do the exact same thing. They preserve identity without fragmentation, and the core mechanism behind both remains entirely hidden from our observation.
So synthesizing all of this dissertation takes theology, which is a field largely bogged down in endless speculative arguments over hidden mechanisms that humans couldn't possibly understand, and it transforms it into a highly disciplined, constraint-based inquiry. Yes.
It says, stop guessing how the engine works. Here's the observable data. Here are the boundaries. Let's find the mathematical model that satisfies the constraints with the lowest degrees of freedom. It doesn't eliminate the mystery of the divine at all.
Not at all.
It contains it. It localizes the mystery behind an event horizon, so we can actually focus our energy on evaluating the observable reality.
And for you, the listener, whether you are interested in history or science or complex systems analysis, this specific framework is a profoundly powerful tool for your daily life.
Yeah, completely.
I mean, we live in an age of severe information overload. We are totally surrounded by opaque algorithms and institutional black boxes. You will rarely get to see the underlying mechanism of the systems governing your life. But evaluating reality based on structural coherence and constraint satisfaction, that is exactly how you cut through the noise.
You map the footprints. You lock in the timeline. You evaluate the outcomes. That is how you find the truth when the cameras are turned off. And I really want to leave you with a final, truly mind-bending thought, pulled straight from the Future Work section of this paper.
Oh, this part is fascinating.
It really is. Now that the author has established this rigorous mathematical way to test the constraints of the incarnation using combinatorial structural topology, They propose applying this exact framework to physical artifacts.
Right. It pushes the model out of ancient texts and straight into the physical world.
Exactly. Imagine taking the Shroud of Turin, one of the most fiercely debated historical objects in the world, and using it as an epistemic stress test. Instead of just arguing endlessly over carbon dating, you build a constraint network of the Shroud's topological properties, the blood anomalies, the 3D encoding, and you mathematically test the degrees of freedom required for a medieval forger to hit all those constraints simultaneously.
Yeah.
Or imagine applying this framework to explore human consciousness itself as a non-decomposable constraint structure. It completely blurs the boundary of where ancient theology ends and quantum-level structural analysis begins.
It suggests that the analytical tools we use to understand the deepest mysteries of antiquity might actually be the exact same mathematical tools we need to decode the fundamental structure of reality today.
It turns out, whether you're looking at a first-century historical claim, an ancient burial cloth, or the origins of your own mind, the secret to finding the truth isn't always about prying open the box to see the gears. Sometimes it's just about standing outside the event horizon, looking closely at the data that manages to escape, and trusting the exact mathematical shape of the constraints it leaves behind.